Okay, can you guys hear me? I know everyone sits in back. I could walk over there and then you wouldn't be in back anymore, right? But then my back would be to these guys. I do like to walk around, especially because I got maybe 3 hours of sleep on the airplane out here. I was so excited to come that I stayed up all night. And yes, I used to say I map crime by day and beer by night, never the two together, but I now am working on some studies to actually prove that craft breweries are good for your economy and don't generate crime like other bars do. So if anyone ever wants to help me do that research, just let me know. I actually taught a class in Albany this past winter, and one of the cops in the class, by the second day, came up to me, I didn't know you were into beer. So 2 days of teaching about problem solving and crime analysis, and what he got out of it was, I'm into beer. And you will see some references in here as well. So let's get started. First, I want to just put it out there. How many people have heard of problem-oriented policing? Most of you. How many people would say it's practiced in your agency? A lot of you as well. Great. So let's see how that kind of plays out with what I'm going to talk about, and love to have not necessarily a debate. This is not the forum for a debate, but love to have a good discussion. I have some things that I'm going to point out, ask you throughout, so I'm not standing up here just talking the whole time. But, you know, people that don't know POP, and I won't throw out names or agencies, well, at least in this case, but was asked to assist a couple of officers a couple weeks ago on a research project that they had some innovative ideas. And they're like, hey, we'd love to talk to some other cops with innovative ideas. And I said, are you going to the POP conference? And one of them said, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know even what you're talking about. So here is one of the more innovative cops in the country, according to other criteria, but yet had never even heard of the Problem-Oriented Policing Conference. So I think it's one of the best conferences in the country, but I'm biased. Obviously, if I teach problem-oriented policing, I'm going to think it. So POP, you know, who calls it? Is it POP or soda in New York? It depends on where you are. I grew up in Michigan. It's POP. And I moved to San Diego, and I'd say, what kind of POP do you have? And the people would just look at me, like at the stores, and I'm like, you know, Coke? Oh, soda. I'm like, yeah. So that's my grandfather, who I called Pop. But in actuality, in this setting, Herman Goldstein coined the term, in 1979, wrote the first article about problem-oriented policing and the way we should rethink we're doing policing. And it didn't really catch on right away. Wrote a book in 1990, and around the same time was when the federal government first started funding some efforts for police departments to try and practice this problem-oriented policing, whatever that means. So I was fortunate. I started my career at San Diego Police Department as a crime analyst in the heyday of problem-oriented policing. So in 1992, they had a grant to study the drug market in a more problem-solving way. So how else can we do research and analysis around the drug market to create more innovative, effective strategies? So I thought that's what crime analysis does, is work with the cops on these big long-term problems. It wasn't, our focus at least then was not on catch the bad guy, wasn't on ComStat and just putting out statistics or just putting out maps. It was really working one-on-one. So that's kind of where I came from, and I was raised in this school of problem-oriented policing with some amazing cops that took me under their wing, as well as researchers. So I've been a crime analyst in a couple of different police departments, in prosecutors' offices, and always had that mindset, and now do a lot of consulting and advising on police and prosecutors on that strategic look. Call it anything you want. It's really about using data analysis to understand problems. It's thinking about looking at crime and reducing and preventing crime by getting at those underlying causes, not at just doing patrol and hoping we catch some people. If we catch people, great. We need to still obviously go out there and do arrests and be proactive in that regard. But we need to think about, and lots of people are out there saying that now, we can't arrest our way out of the problem. So that's what really at the heart of problem-oriented policing, and I'm going to just take you through some of the kind of key points about going back out and practicing problem-oriented policing. So why is problem solving important? As I just mentioned, we really need to understand. A lot of people use the medical analogy, and I know in evidence-based policing, same type of thing. It's really understanding that why and the how. We're really good in law enforcement about saying the who, what, when, and where. We're not nearly as good as truly understanding the how. And so again, here in the next hour or 45 minutes, we're going to talk about trying to get at that why and how, a little more effort than what we traditionally do in law enforcement. So why should we take a problem-solving approach? Offenders are rarely caught. What percentage of your auto thefts are cleared or people arrested? Anyone know? Either your agency, statewide, nationwide? Call out some numbers. 35, I hear. You must be really successful in Vallejo. 23. Keep going down. 3% we hear over here. It's about 10% nationwide. Obviously, some are doing better than others. When we looked at it in San Diego, we had 25,000 auto thefts at the peak in 2004, 2005. And of those, we had 1,900 arrests. Of those, we had 1,500 people prosecuted. Of those, 1,200 some odd got any sort of time in jail, prison, etc. Less than 5% of the total number of auto thieves or auto thefts could we deal with in the criminal justice system. So if we're focusing all our efforts on just catching people, we're not going to get at the bulk of a lot of the problems. High-intensity enforcement is not sustainable. That's one of those obvious ones. We don't have enough cops out there to put everywhere all the time in all of even our worst places. The criminal justice system is overburdened. I know in California we're letting out more people than we're putting in. I don't know how it is in New York, but we also know we just don't have any room at the prisons, nor is it helping process people through the prisons, is not reducing crime just by sending people away. Most of what police are expected to address is not crime or those Part 1 crimes that we always talk about. What are some of your top calls for service in your jurisdictions? Alarm calls? Domestics? What's that? Mentally ill? So none of those, I mean, some of the domestics obviously are assaults, although a couple of different studies have shown that over 60% of domestic violence calls are verbal only and are not actually physical crimes. So if we think about we're spending all of our time responding to all of these calls for service, but yet we're counting only this small subset of the crimes that we typically count. Again, a reason for thinking about problems, not just these Part 1 crimes. Residents care most about non-crime issues. If you go to a community meeting, what do you hear? Speeding, stop sign, traffic issues, right? Noise, parties. In San Diego, scooters. You guys have e-scooters in your jurisdictions yet? Don't let them come in if you don't have them yet. It's the #1 issue on our mayoral election are the e-scooters. It's that bad in San Diego. So we need to think about what are the problems we're dealing with as law enforcement, what are the problems the community cares about, and we're not obviously going to just stop dealing with the more serious crimes, but we also need to consider how can we be more efficient and effective at all of these types of things. So I wanted to run you through a problem-solving effort, a POP project that Chula Vista Police Department did. Chula Vista is near the Mexican border in San Diego County. There's one more city south of Chula Vista. It's actually the city of San Diego again. but has done a lot of different good problem-solving efforts. This actually won the Herman Goldstein Award, an International Problem-Oriented Policing Award, probably about 7, 8 years ago. But the idea being, how many people have crappy motels in their jurisdiction? Generate lots of calls for service, right? Do all of your motels generate equal amounts of calls for service? No. So I worked on a project after this with Anaheim. Disneyland, happy people, right? They have motels less than 2 miles from Disneyland that are these particular problem motels. So it's not happy throughout Anaheim, as many people are not aware. Anyway, they looked at all of their motels, all of the calls for service. What you can see, they found disturbance being the #1 call. So again, if we just looked at crimes and just looked at arrests, we would not see this huge problem that they're having. 5 motels accounted for 28% of the rooms, but 53% of the calls for service. Why should we look at the number of rooms? Why do we care about that and not just say, well, this motel had 10 calls and this motel had 20? Proportion, right? If we have a motel with 10 rooms that has 10 calls for service, and we have a motel with 100 rooms that has 20, which one's the bigger problem? The smaller one, right? We have way higher number per room. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Most motel users are local. How many of you have stayed in a motel in your city? A couple people raising their hands. We don't want to know. Okay. So they were like, well, let's think about what are the underlying reasons why these small number of motels are generating a big percentage of the problem. So they looked at the calls for service. They went out and did observations to just look at the behavior. Who's coming and going? How many people are coming and going? When are they coming and going? They did user surveys. They put that in quotes because it was like, well, the users were, I rented the room to have a party, all the way through, I'm living at this motel. So their users really varied. Interviewed managers, went out there and did environmental surveys of every motel, not just the problems. Because they wanted to know, what is it different? What is it about it? Is it the lighting? Is it the parking lot? Is it fencing around it? What is it contributing to the problems? A literature review, and it doesn't have to be super academic, it's just who else has done stuff about it? What other departments have worked on this problem, as well as what academic articles are important as well. They did site visits. Oakland, California had done a really good project on a Motel 6, so they went up there and said, you know, how did that work for you? And then investigating the causes. And that's the key part of how do we investigate what we think is causing it. So they went through and said, well, we think it's bad neighborhood. Other people said, well, it's because they're not charging very much, local clientele, insufficient police, or poor management. What do you think was the main reason of their problem motels? Or the main cause? Poor management? Anything else?
Low room price.
Low room price? So there was a little bit of a lot of it, and we're going to see how they investigated or tested their theories. So first they said, well, is it just because it's in a bad part of town? It's easy to say that's a bad neighborhood or a high crime neighborhood. Their old part of Chula Vista, the west part of the city, lower income, higher crime, traditionally has a lot of that. But when they looked at it, you can see here, actually there's clicked here, a very low right next to a very high. Over here, very low next to very high. So it wasn't just the neighborhood or even that street that was contributing to it. There had to be something else going on. Then they said, well, is it local and cheap? But again, when they lined them all up, you had non-problems that also had local guests. And so the answer or the response couldn't be just raise your prices or don't rent to locals and that's going to solve your problems, because that wasn't what was necessarily driving it. They said, well, is it because the police haven't spent enough time there? So they compared the calls for service citizens to when they increased officer time in the 5 previous years, it didn't really change much. They reduced the officer time, didn't change much, back up, didn't change much. So it wasn't like just more enforcement or more time there was going to be the answer. So they said, well, if it is poor management practices and a few other things, what can we do? And Herman Goldstein came up with this hierarchy, and it's not like you're going to start at the bottom necessarily and say, that doesn't work, I'm going to go to the next one. But if we think about educating people, owners of the problems, is the easiest thing to do. If we can go to the motels and say, you need to change X, Y, and Z, and they do it, that'd be great. But we all know in reality that that doesn't happen. So then they looked and they said, well, is there anything, can we publicly shame them? There was Tempe, Arizona, years ago, put their top apartment complexes on the internet as to the highest number of calls for service. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're going to do that. It shamed them. The apartments didn't want to be listed on the public website as having a high number of police calls for service, so they cleaned up their act. But in this case, they had to go actually up to the second highest, the legislating prevention. So essentially what they said is, we're going to tell you what you should probably do. We're going to put out there all these crime prevention techniques. You can choose what you need to do, but you have to keep your calls for service under a certain limit. So the median, when they laid out all the motels, was 0.61 per room per year. And they had to keep it under that, or the city would revoke their permit and they were not allowed to be a motel in that city. So they gave them all these different things and said, here motels, here's what works, here's what you can choose to do. In the end, what happened, one of their worst motels said not worth it and sold it. It's now this great little boutique hotel that business people and tourists and everyone in the exact same location, they charge more money, it all worked out. A couple of them, made some changes begrudgingly. Motel 6 fought them tooth and nail, sending out higher and higher people to say, you can't do this, and they still did it. They monitor it year after year, but initially, that's for the 8 years after, and they continue to monitor it, but you can see that drug arrests went way down, as well as crimes went way down. So really digging in, the whole underlying part of this is there's a lot of good problem solving out there. I chose this one partially because I'm very familiar with it, but also because they really were methodical about what do we think is causing it, how do we look at it, instead of just saying, oh, we heard that this city did X, Y, and Z, so we're going to do the exact same thing. So POP involves, you might have heard the Sarah model. Some people theorize, so John Eck and Bill Spellman came up with the Sarah model, and people theorized it was their girlfriend's name or something like that. It really wasn't. It was the idea of scanning, thinking through, how do we put this concept of problem-oriented policing into practice? How does a cop on the street or a police department really do problem-oriented policing? And that's where the Sarah model came from. So scanning is really just identifying those problems. And it's not just looking at total numbers of stats. There's lots of different ways. Fear could be the problem. If you have a neighborhood who are fearful of going out at night, that could be a problem that you work on. And a lot of you have probably worked on those in the past. The analysis is really, again, that understanding those underlying causes and the situations that's driving that. Response, developing the strategies. What we're really good at in law enforcement is jumping to response without truly understanding, is that hitting the right people? I worked in Redlands, small town in Southern California, not a lot of crime. The nickname is Mayberry. And the chief came to me. We had Thursday nights, we had market night. And in Southern California, where it's nice all year round, we could have market night all year round. And Redlands was right here and very low crime, but surrounded by some areas with some gang problems and some serious crime problems. So the gangsters would come to Redlands on market night because they had lots of victims and lots of opportunity, right? So the chief comes to me when I was running this regional project there, and he said, Julie, can you run me some stats? Because we want to put a curfew in place to get rid of the gang problem on market night. I ran the stats. Our gang members that we had contacted and arrested were all over 18, or most of them were over 18. So a juvenile curfew was not going to, we should flip that. We should look and see who are our problem people and then figure out what the strategy is that's going to work best. And then assessment, the hardest part, the least done, the least well done, but it's really assessing that impact. Not just we put up a bunch of signs or we trained a bunch of people, but did you impact the specific problem you were working on? Not just did crime go down citywide or even in that whole district, but did that problem that you were working on? And I have some examples of those as well. So lots of different policing strategies, philosophies, any way you want to think of it out there. There are some things in common definitely around them, and your different agencies have probably practiced or said they practice, or your chiefs have said they practice that. When I teach this class in a big way and have in a big way, when I say that, it's like 2 or more days and have a small group, we really get into talking about this, and I almost always hear, well, my chief or my commissioner says we're a community policing, problem-oriented policing, predictive policing agency. But in practice, what is really happening? That book there, and it's actually been updated recently, is a really nice, relatively easy to read, or if you're kind of a geek like me and like reading these types of books, but it takes a bunch of these different policing strategies and it says, this is why this is the best strategy, and this is why this has some challenges. Not that it's the worst strategy, but here's why it might be weaker. And so it's really nice, written by a bunch of different authors on those contrasting perspectives. And as I said, it's been updated now that we have lots more new strategies that we're talking about. So why problem-oriented policing? One way to think about it is to think about what are the most effective ways that we've seen, that research has shown over the years, to be effective. And so if we think about it as focus, as you see on the bottom line here, low focus to high focus, and then diversity, low to high up here. So our standard or our traditional model, low diversity, low focus. And when we talk about diversity of approaches, of pretty much the traditional model was, right, respond to crime fast. Does responding to crime or calls for service fast reduce crime? Increase clearance rates? No, not really. So we've shown, or research has shown, that that doesn't work necessarily. Just the facts, ma'am, that whole type of thing. So we have our kind of focused policing, right? Hotspots focus, so if we focus just on place, or focus deterrence, we focus just on people. Very effective, but not as diverse. If we go community policing, which over the last, 30 plus years, that's been, we put cops on bikes, and that's community policing. We go to community meetings, we have a citizens academy, all these different approaches, very diverse, but not a lot of focus on the actual crime problems themselves. So problem-oriented policing kind of combines those. There's a lot of kind of laser focus on particular people, problems, places, as well as a diverse approach based on what those people, problems, and places are doing. So we want to just, in terms of problem-oriented policing, rethink our jobs. And when I say rethink, it's not like we're not cops anymore, but as someone mentioned, the whole mental health. There's a lot of talk about, well, we're not social workers, and now we suddenly in law enforcement have to deal with a lot of the mental health and the homeless issues and all of that. It's rethinking about how can we work smarter? Not that, again, we're stupid right now, but how can we use our time more efficiently? How can we work with others and put, if the problem is in the park or the problem is with homeless, who else, not in law enforcement, is working on this that we can work together on? If we have traffic accidents, the traffic engineering in your city or your county should be the first person you're talking to about your traffic accidents, because putting more cops out at that intersection is not going to be a long-term solution. Knowing what works. Does DARE work to reduce drugs in kids? No. Don't admit if your agency still uses DARE. So, but that's what, when we think about that, when I did a lot of the auto theft work and crime prevention around auto theft, I knew way more than I ever wanted to about auto theft and what worked. Do those old men driving around little cars in parking lots reduce auto theft? No. But young people on bicycles in parking lots actually does reduce auto theft. So if your problem is auto theft from parking lots, is going to be a very different than if people are stealing cars from homes and driveways and something like that, because you're obviously not going to have that type of strategy. And that's what we just need to think about. Environmental criminology is not crimes of the environment. It's the idea of looking at place, looking at opportunity, looking at situations. You don't need to be an academic researcher. I mean, people, especially when I went to the prosecutor's office, people are all like, what do you do? I'm a crime analyst. So you're a statistician? No, I'm not a statistician. And your lawyer? No. You're a cop? No. And then they'd walk away. So, but as a crime analyst, we have a range of responsibilities and expertise. And I know if I need fancy statistics, I call one of my favorite PhDs to do that. Understanding some of the theories of environmental criminology, of situational crime prevention and crime pattern theory is a lot of what we're all doing on a daily basis. It's just digging a little deeper on that. Being very crime specific. And this is where I can't say it enough. We gotta get deeper than just counting our weekly, our monthly stats of robberies. We all know that a bank robbery is very different than a street robbery, which is very different than a commercial robbery. And even if we all say, here's how many commercial robberies we have, we know in reality that robbing a jewelry store in broad daylight is a very different problem than robbing the McDonald's drive-thru at 4 in the morning. So instead of just saying we're going to reduce robberies, we want to be as specific as possible to be most effective as possible and create the best types of responses. So we need to really get away from just these broad categories. We still have to count UCR for FBI on a monthly basis, but that's our records divisions, our, sadly, some crime analyst divisions have to do that. But for people working on crime problems, we shouldn't worry about those categories at all. When I ask, and I'm working with a department and I ask for data, and that's all they give me is here's how many we had of this, it's useless to me to do any sort of problem solving if you just have these broad categories. And now that we're looking at, well, gun violence. In those categories, any of those crimes could have guns involved, but we need to figure out, a domestic violence assault is going to be very different than a bar assault and a gang assault, that type of thing. So this slide about Sarah is really just that it's not necessarily a linear process. It'd be nice if it always worked out that you identified your problem, you analyzed it, you responded, and it worked, and you went back on to the next problem. But in reality, a lot of times we think we identified the problem. As you start to look into it, you're like, oh, that's not really the problem. We need to kind of go back and do a little more work. Or we try a strategy. We have a problem with drug dealing down a street, and we close off the street, even if it's temporarily. Doesn't work. We go back and say, well, what else can we do to deal with this drug problem? So scanning in the very traditional definition is 2 or more incidents related in 1 or more ways. We got tired of saying this. In the 90s, when we were doing training of all the San Diego police, it was, you need to do a POP project, and you need to identify a problem using these criteria. And what would the cops do? Oh, I went out and contacted this homeless guy 2 days in a row, so that's 2 or more incidents related, so he's my project. That, we can simplify it, we can, and I always tell people, in San Diego, the heyday of problem-oriented policing, people from all over the world came to San Diego to see what we were doing with problem-oriented policing. Maybe 25% of the department actually practiced and believed in problem-oriented policing. So it's not easy. We could talk CompStat for hours, but that will be with beers later. And that was the thing. When CompStat first started, there was a lot of comparison between, does POP better than CompStat? Again, with CompStat, it's putting up a bunch of numbers and saying, what are we going to do about it in that very early version? But it's very popular. So CompStat spread like wildfire, yet problem-oriented policing, which of course I'm biased, but makes a lot more sense, and there's a lot of studies that show how it's reduced crime. Analysis, again, I started with we're good at the where, when, what, who, in terms of individual crimes or series of crimes. When we're talking about problems, it's adding in that why and the how, but it's also thinking about, if I say, where are your, you might start with all of your shootings or all of your domestic violence. Pick any crime, and no matter where I am and who I ask, they always happen everywhere all the time. We know, again, from research and in reality, that crime is very concentrated, no matter what crime. Domestic violence, not necessarily a place-based crime problem, but still concentrated with a small number of people, especially the ones doing the repeats. So thinking about the who was involved, not individual names of people, but that 70% of your people were between 18 and 24, or that we found in the domestic violence work I've been working on the last few years, we have a lot higher number of homeless domestic violence suspects and victims than we originally thought. Dealing with them is very different than dealing with people that have stable homes and stable jobs in that particular problem. The response, so we'd love to eliminate all problems, but again, we all know we're not going to eliminate crime. But we could eliminate a crime problem in particular places, whether it's an apartment complex or a park or a motel or a convenience store. So is that realistic, or is it more realistic to reduce the problem? Or thinking about reduce the harm the problems are causing. So in a weird kind of, when I worked on a Cambodian gang problem in San Diego. This was in the mid to late 90s. And they were doing a lot of drive-by shootings. And we heard at the time that the Mexican mafia had come down on the Mexican gangs and said, don't be a chicken shit and do a drive-by shooting. Go up and stab the guy if you have a beef with him. So in that weird way, a lot less people die, right? Stabbed versus shot, and a lot less innocent victims. Not that we were promoting that they should all start stabbing people, but thinking about, can we reduce the harms that the gangs were causing? We knew we couldn't eliminate the gang, but how could we get the gun? Our strategy at that point was get the guns out of the hands of the Cambodian youth. And we worked with the religious organizations and the families and some of the nonprofits on doing with that. Assessment, did it work? I mean, again, it's easy to count widgets. It's easy to count, here's how many people we arrested, how many people we trained, how many signs we put up. But did that actually reduce the problem that you were focused on? And it can be a relatively simple, and I have an example of as simple as possible in the way to look at things. So in terms of scanning, so who can identify problems? It can be the cop in the street. It might be your dispatchers who talk to a lot of people and hear a lot of problems that never get into the official data that we can learn from them. We have our geeky either crime analyst or research partner and the generic community out there too. We need to just get away from just looking at our official stats to identify problems. So I believe this is Albany, just based on the next map. So these were some slides when I did some training earlier this year in Albany. And as I started with, when I asked you what your top calls for service, as you can see, very few of them, none of the first 10 are Part 1 crimes. Most agencies, whether it's a big urban city or a small town, you're going to see the same patterns. So Jerry Radcliffe's done a lot of research in Philadelphia, and same type of thing. Very few violent crimes and even Part 1 crimes when you start looking at everything that the police are doing. These were the fight calls. So we're over here somewhere, right? Right now? I think we're right here. So anyone from Albany in here? Who knows what this big dot is that's right near us? Let's hope it's not City Beer Hall, right? because that would defeat my theory of craft beer being related. But it's throwing that, where are the fights happening? And fights being calls, because some fights might turn into arrests, assault arrests, or assault victim crime cases, but there are a lot of fight calls that the police respond to that are just calls and never respond. So looking at calls for service is key to really understanding our problems. When are they happening? There might be fights around bars in one area happening at certain times, but fights at a school or in another area are happening at a different time. So really breaking that out. But it's easy in most of our data and most of our systems these days to just throw it onto a map, throw it into a program to start with, and then ask some further questions. So when you're identifying a problem, here's a nice little model to think about. Cheers, that's an easy way to remember it. But when you're identifying your problem, who is being affected? What are the effects? How often is it happening? Again, we can easily say, we have a drug dealing problem or a gang problem or whatever the problem is, and it's happening all the time. We want to know, is it happening way more on Friday nights versus any other night, or when kids get out of school, or whatever that problem is? And then what is the similarity? Is it the same victim type, the same offender group? So not the similarity, is it the same MO that people are using? Because whatever that similarity is might be what we need to focus on in terms of the response. And that leads us to the problem analysis triangle. So this was created based on the fire triangle. 3 things to make a fire, right? So what are the 3 things to make a fire? Oxygen, fuel, and heat. So the idea of putting out a fire, you got to get rid of one of those things. Same idea with crime. Every crime has an offender, a victim, or a target, and a place where it's happening. Traditionally, we've focused on that suspect or offender side of the triangle. If only we take out the offender, we'll get rid of crime. We know that's not always the case. It's still sometimes the case, but a lot of times we either need to educate the victim, change something about the target, or change something about the place to make it less easy or less opportunistic to commit the crime. Outside of the triangle are the managers of each. So we have place managers we need to work with. We have the handlers of the offenders. It might be teachers. It might be probation officers. It might be parents. But all of those people are either with us, and when I say us, law enforcement or the community, with us or against us, and we need to know that ahead of time, so we need to figure out who those people are in those groups. We ask all of our questions, so when you're thinking about doing your analysis, it's just a brainstorming around each side of the triangle. What do we want to know about the victims? Well, we want to know their age, their race. I mean, a lot of the crime problems, we have the same types of questions, but then certain crime problems may have other unique questions around that particular place or person on either side of that triangle. So, I'll give you a second to read that. So if we took away all those controls, would crime go up? I'm seeing some yes nods. Yeah? There might be a different norm. That's a good point. What about in the recession in 2008, 9, whenever the recession was? Did crime go up? How come? So if we lost our jobs, we wouldn't suddenly go become criminals, right? Most of us, I would think. But if the opportunity, so let's think about residential burglaries. When do those occur? Daytime, because people are at work. If we have less people working, there's actually less opportunity to break into people's houses. So there's less opportunity, less people during the recession were driving to the mall and driving to places, so less cars out there to be stolen, less people to rob, perhaps. So the recession, everyone expected crime to skyrocket. Some crimes did, so domestic violence went up because more people were at home. There was more opportunity for conflict and people were all stressed out. Insurance fraud went up. But things like insurance fraud, police departments generally don't, count or capture. But it's just thinking through that opportunity and how do we change that opportunity when we go to reduce the crime. Hotspots, it's everyone's favorite word. Hotspot policing and hotspots, and I make hotspot maps. Everyone makes hotspot maps these days. What's key in terms of problem solving is understanding those hotspot places. Understanding the size, the shape, the what is it, and why is it. So if you have a shopping mall, you have a sporting event, you have a popular bar, you have a lot of people, you have a lot of potential victims. Those are crime generators. And so you're going to have different types of responses than if it's not that many people, but a high amount of crime. There's something attractive, the crime attractors, there's something attractive about that place. So your response is going to have to be, how can we make that less attractive? How do we make, we didn't. How did copper theft become less attractive to copper thieves? The prices went down, right? So we didn't control that. How did auto theft, speaking of auto theft, how did auto theft go down? I know it's going back up a little bit, but over the last 10, 15 years, it went way down. Anyone know why? Technology, right? Engine immobilizers in cars. So when I was working on auto theft a lot from like 2003 to 2006, in 2003, Honda Civics were the #1 car stolen in, I think, all of California, definitely at least Southern California. They were also the #1 car on the road. So if you divided the number of thefts by the number of opportunities to steal, it wasn't as high. I bought a Honda Civic in 2003, and everyone's like, are you crazy? You just did all this research. I'm happy to say I still drive it today. I know that's a little weird, 16 years later, but I live at the beach and mostly walk. Okay, anyway, it was the first year they had engine immobilizers in it, and studies had already shown outside of the US that putting in engine immobilizers in the cars, the little chip in your key, reduced auto theft immensely. So it's that knowing what's working, reducing the opportunity. We still have plenty of auto thieves out there. They figure it out. But it's all those opportunistic people, which most of our criminals are opportunistic, that's what we're trying to change. So the hot places, it's really getting at, I call them blob maps. That's what's most popular. And you ask people, you ask most cops on the street, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm told to drive around that big red blob or that big red spot. We want to dig deeper. We know crime happens at specific places, so why not analyze it and visualize it that way? So here's an example from the UK, because they like their blob maps too. Spencer Cheney was working with a department, and they had this map. It's theft of vehicles, lots of red blobs. We could send cops out there to drive around the red blobs. We know that's not overly helpful. So they dug deeper, and into the one blob, they now had more specific, still littler blobs, but they said, well, what's going on here? So they looked at some stats, and it might be hard to see, especially in the back, but anyone see what jumps out there as the types of vehicle stolen? %73% were two-wheeled vehicles. Very different problem, right? Anyone have any ideas on what's going on? It's easy, so the opportunity, it's easier to steal one than, how about that there's just a parking area? So they're all there for the taking. If they made that one parking area more secure, they could reduce a huge percentage of their theft. When I was working on auto theft, I was working with the Regional Auto Theft Task Force in San Diego, and they got a call one day from Coronado, from the naval base. and they said, we're getting hit with motorcycle thefts. Can you guys come over and take a look and help us out? So 2 detectives went over there, and the commander takes them to this big open area and says, here's where they're told to park when they get deployed. So essentially it was saying, offenders, you have your choice of beautiful motorcycle for the next 6 months, and it's all in this big open area. So instead of trying to do something complex, either make it more secure and or don't let it be known that you're going to have motorcycles just parked there unwatched for 6 months or 9 months. A relatively newer way of looking at crime, and I think a really nice way, especially when we're looking at crime like drug dealing on the street or street robberies, because we may not have an exact address, but even when we do have exact addresses, we can join them to the street segments. And we see here, and what we've seen in a lot of places, you have a hot segment right next to cold segments. Hot segment next to a cold segment. So when we do these, the fancy name being kernel density, the blob maps, we're masking, this whole area would show red when in fact it's just a couple of segments that are the problem. So whether it's you asking your analyst for a map, some of you might be making your own maps with some different tools, just think about, you have your common sense, your intel, your knowledge of, oh my gosh, I know that apartment complex is what's really generating it. The blob's not going to help you, but that giant dot where the apartment complex is compared to all the other apartment complexes, that's what's going to help drive other people's buy-in to say this is the problem and not just this whole area is bad. And that leads to the 80-20 rule, and that whether it's places or people or products, if you look at your shoplifting problem, you have certain things. I don't know how many different jurisdictions that I've heard that TVs are one of the #1 things shoplifted from Walmart. Like, what the heck? How do you walk out of the Walmart with a TV? But it's happening. And so, different problem than people putting little stuff in their pockets and walking out the front door. From what I've heard in a couple of places, they go out the fire doors, and I don't know in your jurisdictions if you have Walmart and if you have a problem. But it's narrowing that down. It's zeroing in on, are there things and what can we change about that? We're never going to eliminate shoplifting, but if we can reduce the amount of shoplifting of certain things, that's going to, especially things that are contributing to a big part of the problem. Displacement versus diffusion. Constant battle, although generally in the public's eye and in the police, most police eye, displacement wins. As in other words, people think if we focus on this area, the crime's just going to move, or the people are just going to move. When in actuality, all the research shows that not only does that not happen, that this diffusion of benefits actually happens more often than the displacement. And here's an example. This would be on burglary of apartments, and just the idea that, you know, for the naysayers and the displacement, well, they'll just move to a different apartment. But in actuality, what happens is the offenders don't know you're only focused on one apartment complex, so they're going to probably reduce burglaries in the apartment complexes around there. So you need to think about it and think about ahead of time. If we do this, and it's not just geographic displacement, if you focus on right after school, you have a lot of fights going on, and so you do your extra strategies, are the kids going to find a different place or a different time to fight? So it's just thinking about what's going to change once I do my strategy. Just a laundry list of websites, and I'm going to share this whole PowerPoint out, but some of the greatest ones for figuring out who else has done some really good projects, what does the research show. Some are more researchy than others in terms of here's what was accomplished, here's whether there was a scientific experiment around it, or whether, you know, what type of evaluation was done. And that, you know, don't reinvent the wheel. The Center for Problem-Oriented Policing has 74, I believe, guidebooks around very specific problems. Here's the example. It's not just assaults, because assaults in and around bars is a very different problem than gang fights or domestic violence assaults. So each of these guidebooks are, here's what we know about the problem, kind of like here's what research says, here's the questions you should ask for your analysis, and then here are the most effective responses and when they work, how they work best, etc. Very easy reading, free. You can download them off the website, or if you like paper, Department of Justice can mail you one as well. So thinking about when we're collecting data, it's usually pretty easy to get our own crime data, our own arrest data, our own official data, calls for service. It's not as easy, it takes more work, but some of the most effective problem-solving projects took one or more of these things. We went out and did surveys, whether it was an environmental survey or a survey of people. We went out and did observations, gathering more information to understand your problem. I worked on a Somali gang problem in San Diego, and this was only about 6 years ago. And law enforcement said, we have a huge problem with Somali gang members recruiting teenage girls into, and they would human traffic them. And I was like, well, have you talked to the community all? No, we can't trust the community. They're all, you know, this and that. And so another friend of mine was working for a nonprofit in the community where most of the Somali live. And he said, we're having a meeting. Do you want to just come and listen in, talk, tell them what you're working on, whatever? There were a bunch of people, the community members there, like, we're really worried about our teenage daughters because we know that they're being human trafficked. And I said, well, oh, okay, sorry. Why is the trolley lot way riskier? Way more opportunity, right? The offenders know that if this lot is used primarily for commuting, people are parking their car at 7:30 and not coming back till 5:30 or whatever that is, and they have a lot more time and even if it's a small lot, focused on that. Repeat victimization. We talk about repeat victimization in terms of people. We have certain crimes that we have way more patterns of repeat victimization, but we need to also think about those places, those products, etc. Why would condoms be a big problem of theft? Embarrassment. Very good. There was research, and it was those non-typical offenders were willing to steal because they were too embarrassed to walk up to the cash register and admit they were buying condoms. So here's your test. We have a couple test questions to finish off the class. What's the risk of a home being re-burglarized? I hear C. Anyone? D. One more on this. How about the chances of repeat? Four times. Couple things on this. It was several research studies around this, but it was from the UK where a lot of the repeat residential burglary studies have been done. There have been other studies since that have shown different. So the 2 points on this that I wanted to make were, A, use research, but make sure you analyze your own data to see whether you are having the same patterns as others, and there's lots of tools and people to help you do that. But then the other point being, how can we use that information? Instead of just responding to residential burglaries as we typically do, think about if we know they're more likely to repeat, what else can we do to either talk to them or, again, in the UK, what they've used is a strategy called Cocooning, where they actually contact every other house within a certain distance of the house that was burglarized to let them know you're now more likely to get your house burglarized because there was a burglary on the street. And that has reduced the amount of burglaries and repeat burglaries in those studies. Repeat offending, this was a series of questions we just asked our auto thieves to try and prove, we know they were going to Mexico, can we gather additional information around that? So you've done all this analysis, and it's just thinking about getting to that most effective response, and it's got to be just really targeted and understanding that it's usually a team, that one officer is not going to be the answer to a lot of these problems that we work on that are bigger than one person or one simple response. And that situational crime prevention, the concept is around opportunity blocking, and it's thinking about not just target hardening, which is probably the most common of these that we all do, because it's easy to do, it's been done for a long time, but it's, again, once you understand the why and the how they're doing it, it's thinking through what can we do to change. So here's your last test question. Is this a form of situational crime prevention? Is this increasing the risk, increasing the effort, reducing the rewards? What is this accomplishing? Reducing the rewards and increasing the risk. We're watching you, because if you were going to rob us of Oxy, we don't have any on site to rob us of. So stores putting up signs, this was in Canada, and Canada has actually done a lot of really good work on reducing the amount of pharmacy robberies and other prescription-related fraud. And so all the cops in the world can't reduce as effectively and definitely not monetarily, or we don't have the resources as much as a store putting up a sign like that. How about this one? So I think Jason might relate to this too, because being in California, this was in San Diego. So this is removing excuses, because in San Diego, where we rarely get snow, people don't know it's illegal to pick up that snow that you're so excited to see for the first time and throw it at a car. So putting up signage appropriately for people to understand. Increasing the effort, right, to cause mayhem or havoc in Philadelphia when the Eagles win? Is that too close to home here? Okay, last one. I told you a beer thing, right? What is this? What type of situational crime prevention are they doing here? Exactly. So higher alcohol means you can't drink as much, and we're putting it in a smaller glass. So it's things like this that can be done by owners of places that are potentially problems that are very basic responses, but it's up to us often to suggest and educate and all of that. Finding the owner of the problem and, again, educating them. We saw this through Herman Goldstein's hierarchy, and then just figuring out, can we afford to do this response? Do we have a high enough champion? All of that. And then lastly, conducting the evaluation. And it's both that process is important to count those widgets, but ultimately the impact of what you've been doing. And so in this last example, here's your basic at Temple University. And they had a problem. This was many years ago, but did a survey, outside assaults. We see they had 4 clusters. They put up kiosks, lighting, and had people staffing them that could walk you across campus. So their evaluation the following year all went down, especially in their hotspot cluster areas. So you can do things very simply. It's always nice to do, especially for the bigger projects, a more complex and scientific evaluation. But that shouldn't stop us from doing problem solving and evaluating our projects. Sorry, 2 minutes. Oh my God, I'm between you and beer, or you guys are between me and beer. One of the two. Okay. Any questions? You can all leave, but I'll be here if anyone has any questions. Okay, you can all leave. Thank you.